When they changed our names, they hoped we would forget who we were. They hoped we would forget the fire that ran through our veins. The kings and queens buried beneath the dust of forgotten kingdoms, the drums that spoke in sacred codes, the songs that summoned spirits, and the ancestral wisdom passed from tongue to tongue like sacred fire. They thought if they erased our names, they could erase our nations. But names are not just sounds, they are memory. They are connection. They are blood. And this story, though buried under centuries of shame and silence, is not lost. It still beats in our bones. This is not just history. It is the truth of our people, the truth of stolen tribes, distorted legacies, and the glory they tried to bury in chains. But chains cannot kill what is eternal. Our names once danced with the stars, from the shores of Senegal to the banks of the Congo, from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of Ghana. Our names were stories, meanings, prayers. They were Kofi and Kwame, Nia and Zuberi, Amina and Chika. They carried the spirits of the lands that birthed us, names that meant hope, strength, courage, and joy. They were not just given, they were inherited, built into the rhythms of families, the architecture of clans, the identity of entire nations. To know your name was to know where you came from and where you were going. It meant you belonged. But then came the storm, the ships, the shackles, the trade of flesh for profit. And with every chained wrist, a name was ripped away and replaced. A boy named Oluwaseun became John. A girl named Nodzi became Mary. Identities were broken like bones. They called us savage so they wouldn't have to call us human. They called us heathens so they wouldn't have to recognize our prophets. They called us primitive so they wouldn't have to face the temples we built in silence. With the crack of a whip and the ink of a stolen ledger, they renamed millions of our ancestors, not just with new names, but with numbers, brands, false genealogies. They told us to forget our language, our gods, our ancestors. They told us to kneel. But even as the whip scarred our skin, it could not reach the soul. Our ancestors whispered in the night. They sang in hidden tongues. They braided messages into hair, carved symbols into wood, and passed stories through silence. That was our resistance. Even as our names were changed, our spirit refused to die. Do you know what happens to a people when you steal their names? You steal their home. You steal their map. You steal their roots and plant confusion. You make them believe they come from nothing. But we never came from nothing. We came from empires. We came from Yoruba kingdoms, Benin bronzes, Ashanti thrones, Zulu warriors, Dahomey queens, Fulani scholars, and Igbo dreamers. We came from griots, who could recite 500 years of ancestry without reading a single book. We came from builders, scientists, philosophers, priests, and warriors long before Europe ever knew the tastes of soap. The names they erased were doorways to all of that. So the erasure was not accidental, it was intentional. Because if you can make a people forget who they are, you can control what they become. But even in forgetting, we remembered. Somewhere in the marrow of our descendants, the old names whispered. They rose in dreams. They stirred during drumbeats. They echoed through gospel songs that had African rhythms hiding under Western melodies. They clung to the chants at baptisms, the ululations at funerals, the dances at weddings. And now we are rising again. All across the world, Black men and women are digging through the ashes, uncovering the bones of truth, piecing together the puzzle of who we are. DNA tests are guiding our footsteps back to homelands we never physically knew but always spiritually belonged to. Language is returning to our lips. We are speaking Swahili, Twi, Iwi, Wolof, and Shona again. We are naming our children after ancestors, not oppressors. We are finding out that the name Kunta Kinte was not fiction. It was our reality. That the story of being whipped into accepting the name Toby was not just a movie. It was the daily horror for millions. We are learning that slave records did not list tribes, only Negro, male, age 18, because recognizing tribes would be recognizing nationhood. But make no mistake, The tribes were real. The Mendi, the Mandinka, the Akan, the Igbo, the Fang, the Bakongo. Their customs were carried in bodies like sacred scrolls. Their dances became the foundation of jazz, blues, reggae, samba, hip-hop, gospel, and more. Their rhythms became the heartbeat of every continent. What they thought was destruction became transformation. You see, you can break the tree, but if the root is alive, the tree will grow again. That's what's happening now. Black children in America, Brazil, the Caribbean, and Europe are realizing they are not lost. They are scattered. We are not cursed. We were kidnapped. And now the scattered pieces are becoming whole again. This story is not just about sorrow. It is about resurrection. It is about the revival of what was buried. And every time a black child learns that they come from greatness, the spell of inferiority breaks a little more. Every time we speak the names they tried to erase, our ancestors stand taller in the spirit realm. To the world, we say, you may have changed our names, but you did not change our essence. You may have stolen our past, but you could not steal our future. We carry the memory of our tribes in our bones, and bones do not lie. We carry the rhythm of our people in our steps, and steps do not forget. We are rising not as a broken people, but as a remembered people. We are the living proof that truth cannot stay buried forever, that history, no matter how twisted, eventually finds its voice. So when they ask why we search for African names, African roots, African truth, it is not because we hate where we are, it's because we must remember where we came from. You cannot build the future without knowing the foundation. You cannot heal the wound if you deny the pain. This is not about guilt, it is about truth. This is not about anger, it is about justice. This is not about revenge, it is about resurrection. Because when you resurrect a people's memory, you resurrect their power. And I say this to every young black soul who feels lost, unworthy, disconnected. You are not a mistake. You are not the descendant of slaves. You are the descendant of enslaved kings and queens, teachers and healers, warriors and visionaries. The chains they put on your ancestors were meant to silence them, but their blood still speaks. Their dreams are not dead. They live in you. When you walk into a room, you bring an entire lineage with you. When you speak your name with pride, you resurrect thousands of names buried in silence. When you choose to learn your history, you declare war on the lie that you are less than. So rise, not with bitterness, but with boldness. Rise, not with shame, but with certainty. Rise, not because you are better, but because you are worthy, worthy of knowing the truth, worthy of speaking the names they tried to make us forget, worthy of standing tall in the knowledge that you come from greatness. This is our time. This is our moment. Let the world hear us say, we remember, we rise, we return. They took people and made them property, and in doing so, they knew they couldn't simply chain the body. They had to erase the soul. To turn a human into cargo, you must first strip away their ring, their language, their family, their story. And that is exactly what was done to millions of African men, women, and children who were kidnapped from their homelands. What came first was the tearing away from tribe and kin, the loss of that village identity, that belonging that connects one to a land, to a people, to a history. These weren't just random people taken from a continent. They were Yoruba, Ashanti, Igbo, Mende, Wolof, Fulani, Bantu, each with distinct customs, religions, languages, systems of governance, and deep-rooted traditions. They were not nameless or primitive. They were members of complex societies. But as soon as they were forced onto slave ships, their tribal identities were erased like chalk in rain. At the point of capture, the transformation began. Names that had been passed down for generations, names that connected a person to their ancestors and spiritual lineage, were ripped away and replaced with foreign ones. The enslavers didn't care to know who was from the Oyo Empire or the Kingdom of Congo. They didn't care who had once trained as a warrior or who had been a priestess, a healer, a farmer, a musician. All of that was deliberately blurred and ignored. In slave ledgers, names were replaced with abbreviations like Negro, male age 22. A tribe was not profitable. A number was. A culture could resist. A broken, dehumanized tool could not. And so a deliberate system was born. not only to enslave but to erase. Once the enslaved arrived in the Americas or the Caribbean, this process continued. New names were forced upon them: John, Mary, William, Sarah, not as a kindness but as a final blow to cultural annihilation. These names were not theirs. They were badges of ownership, often taken from the plantation owner himself. Many enslaved people were branded with iron, just as cattle were, and recorded in inventories alongside horses and tobacco. The deliberate de-identification process was not random. It was methodical. Spiritual warfare. To sever one's connection from their tribe was to strip them of pride, unity, and memory. Without a name, without a tribe, a person becomes easier to control. This is how they turned a continent's children into commodities. But even in the midst of this brutality, the human spirit resisted. Though official records reduced them to numbers, African people held on to slivers of who they were in hidden ways. They hummed melodies that had traveled across oceans. They cooked meals using ancestral methods. They found ways to communicate in hybrid languages, blending tongues from different regions to form new creoles that still carried the pulse of home. Though forbidden, they passed on fragments of their native tongues, even if only in lullabies or whispered prayers. A woman from the Gola tribe might teach her daughter to wrap her hair a certain way, not knowing she was preserving the fashion of a forgotten kingdom. A man might teach his son to carve wood, shaping the memory of a village no longer mapped. They remembered in the only ways they could. But what does this erasure mean today? It means that millions of descendants of the enslaved still search for who they are. They carry English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish last names, but none of those names are truly theirs. Their roots were obscured on purpose. This is why so many African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans often feel like they come from nowhere. This was by design. When someone is disconnected from their tribe, they become easier to dominate. When someone cannot call on their ancestors, they can be convinced they are weak. This is not a failure of the people, it is the success of a cruel system. But now the tide is turning. We are living in a time when DNA testing is unearthing old truths. People are beginning to discover that they descend from the Mandinka, the Akan, the Tutsi, the Ha. They are learning that they were not just slaves. They were stolen royalty, broken scholars, interrupted prophets. They are learning that being African is not shameful, it is sacred. As they reclaim these lost truths, something shifts inside them. They stand taller, they speak with more purpose. They begin to understand that the number assigned to their ancestors was never their identity. The name stolen from their great-great-grandfather is not the end of the story. The act of stripping a name was the act of stealing a future, but the future is not lost. As more and more people awaken to the knowledge of who they were before the chains, they are beginning to repair what was broken, and in that repair there is healing. We begin to realize that while they took the name, they could never take the essence. While they erased the records, they could not erase the blood. The memory is still in the DNA. The rhythm is still in the walk. The greatness is still in the spirit. The African soul remembers even when the mind forgets. This is why reclaiming names, researching history, and restoring tribal knowledge is not just academic. It is revolutionary. It is spiritual. It is liberating. So when we say from tribe to number, we are not just talking about history, we are naming a wound, and through truth we are beginning to close it. The goal is not to hate but to heal, not to stay in sorrow but to rise in power. Because every time we speak a tribal name that was nearly lost, we undo what centuries of erasure tried to cement. And every time a young black child learns the truth of their origin, they walk forward not as a shadow but as a rising sun. There is a reason our hearts ache when we hear the drums. There is a reason tears rise when we touch the soil of a land we have never stepped foot upon, but somehow know deep within. The blood remembers. It remembers what the mind has been taught to forget. It remembers the names that were stripped, the languages that were silenced, the prayers that were buried under fear. Long before written records and DNA swabs, long before archives and genealogy charts, we carried our story in the body. And even when the world told us we had no history, that we came from nowhere, that our people were savages, picked at random from an unknown land, something within us quietly refused to accept that lie. because the truth was never completely lost. It lived in the marrow of our bones, in the rhythm of our walk, in the way we mourn and celebrate, in the fire that will not be extinguished. When the ships came and tore generations from the shores of Africa, the intention was not just to enslave, but to erase. The plan was not only to capture labor, but to sever memory. But memory does not live only in books or maps. It lives in blood. And though the names of our villages were forgotten, and the names of our grandmothers and great-grandfathers were never recorded, we still carry them inside of us. That is why we are drawn to the colors of kente cloth, why we find our voice in the pulse of the drum, why we feel something ancient awaken when we hear words in Swahili, Wolof, Yoruba, or Twe. We may not know the translation, but our spirit understands. This is not coincidence. This is inheritance. The blood carries what was meant to be kept secret. And as the world changes, as knowledge becomes more accessible, we are beginning to see this inheritance rise to the surface. African descendants across the diaspora are waking up to the call that has never stopped echoing, a call to remember, a call to reconnect, a call to return, not just physically, but spiritually. This return is not always a plane ticket to Ghana or Nigeria or Senegal. Sometimes it is the first time a person hears the name of the tribe they descend from. Sometimes it is learning that the music they grew up with has ancient roots stretching back to Mali and Congo. Sometimes it is realizing that the way their grandmother danced or the way their grandfather told stories was not just habit. It was ancestral. It was survival wrapped in tradition. For generations, Black people were told their story began in chains. But more and more are now learning that their story began with kingdoms, sciences, philosophies, cosmologies, and lineages older than many Western civilizations. And that knowledge is not just informative, it is transformative. Because once a person understands that they come from people who built pyramids, mapped the stars, and governed vast empires, their posture changes, their self-worth rises. They begin to walk like someone who is descended from greatness, not degradation. That is what the blood knows. It does not forget who we are. It only waits for us to remember. Oral traditions, dreams, and spiritual awakenings are guiding us back. They are helping fill in the gaps that history books refuse to print. When an elder tells a story about a lost ancestor, that is not just folklore. That is a thread in the great tapestry. When a mother names her child a traditional African name despite being born in America or the Caribbean, she is continuing a legacy of defiance and remembrance. When a young person dreams of lands they've never visited, wearing clothes they've never seen, speaking words they've never been taught, it is not fantasy, it is the blood speaking in the language of spirit. It is the past asking to be brought forward. And now, through modern science and ancient memory, we are piecing together the shattered glass of our identity. DNA tests do not give us all the answers, but they offer a compass. They show us that our lineages are not lost. They stretch across rivers and forests, deserts and cities, from the Horn of Africa to the Cape of Good Hope. And with every new discovery, we stitch back what was torn. The knowledge of tribe, of culture, of language, of food, of music. It is being revived person by person, soul by soul. But this is not just a personal journey. It is a collective healing. When one person remembers, they bring light to others. When a family rediscovers its roots, an entire generation is given a foundation. When a community embraces its ancestral story, it gains power. This reclamation is not about division. It is about completeness. It is not about rejecting where we are now, but embracing everything we have always been. We are not defined by our oppression. We are defined by our endurance and by the brilliance of what existed before the interruption. The greatest tragedy was not just the physical bondage. It was the psychological war, the rewriting of our identity. They did not want us to know that we came from something holy, something ancient, something sovereign. But we know now, and we are unlearning the lies, decoding the inherited trauma, and uncovering the buried legacy. The path is not easy. It takes courage to face the silence, to search for what was hidden, to honor ancestors whose names were stolen, But in doing so, we honor ourselves. We give ourselves the right to be whole. There is something sacred happening in this age, a global awakening, a movement not led by governments or institutions, but by the hearts of everyday people who want to know where they came from. And they are finding that their ancestors are not just statistics in a ledger. They were builders, singers, dancers, warriors, scribes, and visionaries. And they are still with us, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be called by name again. We do not come from broken. We come from brilliance interrupted. We are not lost. We are in recovery. And the journey of recovery is also the journey of power. So when the world tells you that you are nothing, that your people have no history, that your name is not important, remember this: your blood remembers what they tried to destroy. Your dreams remember what they tried to erase. Your existence is the proof that they failed. You are the continuation of a mighty river, not a stagnant pool. You are the echo of those who endured, not the silence of those who were forgotten. The blood remembers, and now so do we. They tried to erase the soul by removing the sound of our names, but the spirit found a way to speak without words. What they did not understand was that a name is not the only carrier of memory. A name may be stolen, but spirit is resilient. Culture does not only live in books or scrolls, it lives in the way the hands move when braiding hair, the way the hips sway to rhythms older than time, the way grief is expressed in a wail or joy in a beat that compels the feet to move. The erasure was methodical, calculated to make people forget where they came from. Yet even when languages were silenced and spiritual practices were banned, African culture disguised itself. It became hidden in plain sight. The enslaved people forced into foreign lands and foreign names embedded the old world inside the new. They spoke with their bodies when their mouths were silenced. They passed down what could not be written by encoding it into rhythm, color, flavor, song, and silence. What they couldn't kill, we carried. They beat the drum out of the village, so we beat it into the church. They stripped us of shrines, so we built spirit altars in our voices. They banned our languages, so we sang in tongues that had pieces of them buried inside. The field songs, the spirituals, the chants under moonlight. They were never just music. They were survival. They were sacred code. When the enslaved people sang "Wade in the Water," it wasn't just a hymn, it was instruction. When they danced late into the night, it wasn't just release, it was remembrance. The circle they formed wasn't just for movement, it was the memory of ritual, of ceremony, of calling down spirit. Even in the brokenness, even in the forced baptism into another man's religion, they brought their gods with them in disguise. They knew how to hide truth in plain sight. Hair became a map, not just a style. In cornrows, they hid paths to freedom. In beads and braids, they coded messages that couldn't be spoken. Hairstyles became a language when language was forbidden. They braided resistance. They locked memory. Even under watchful eyes, they passed down patterns that held significance only they could understand. When mothers sat daughters between their knees, they weren't just combing, they were transferring legacy. They were brushing away shame. They were sculpting identity in silence. Stories carried what chains couldn't hold. When grandmothers told tales of talking animals and trickster spirits, they were preserving more than entertainment. They were embedding morality, cosmology, survival strategies from lands across the sea. The tales were vessels. Anansi didn't just entertain, he remembered. The hare and the tortoise weren't just clever fables, they were encoded knowledge, cloaked in metaphor. And every child who heard those stories heard something deeper. The echo of who they were, where they came from, and what it meant to stay human in a world that tried to deny it. Clothing was expression, even when fabric was scarce. The way a head wrap was tied spoke volumes to those who knew how to read it. Colors and patterns were more than decoration. They carried ancestral vibration. The enslaved, though stripped of their original garments, reimagined tradition with what was available. In the hems of dresses, in the folds of scarves, the old world was stitched back together, one thread at a time. Even food held secrets, spices, combinations, preparation techniques. They weren't just about nourishment. They were cultural memories served hot. The okra that thickened the stew, the yams mashed with bare hands, the rice grown with precision. These were not accidents. They were ancient knowledge. Recipes became ritual. Meals became ceremony. In the bitterness of forced labor, sweetness was carved out through food that reminded the soul it had roots. The body itself became a sacred vessel of resistance, movement, gesture, posture, all used to carry a language denied. Dance became not just joy but prayer. Movement became worship. In stomps and claps and shoulder rolls, messages were sent, spirits were invoked, ancestors were honored. They thought they had taken the ceremonies, but they hadn't realized the ceremony had moved into the marrow. The enslaved didn't need temples, they became the temple. Even in religion, where they were baptized into a belief system meant to erase theirs, they reimagined God in their own image. They saw divinity in blackness, even when the pictures in the churches showed the opposite. They gave praise in tones that sounded nothing like Europe, but everything like Africa. Call and response, shouting, testifying. The spirit moved the same way it always had. The names were different, but the energy was familiar. The ancestors were never far. They were simply renamed, reformed, retold. African cosmology didn't die. It evolved under duress. And so generation after generation, the flame stayed lit, not in textbooks, but in traditions, not in lectures, but in lullaby. The colonizers and enslavers thought they had erased a culture, but they had only chased it into shadow. And shadows do not disappear. They move, they wait, and now they rise. Today, the children of those who survived that erasure are remembering again, not just through books or DNA kits, but through a return to what never left. They are unbraiding stories, unmuting rhythms, unearthing rituals. They are reclaiming names not just for themselves but for all those who never had the chance. They are realizing that the spirit of a people cannot be renamed, only disguised. That what survived was not broken, it was preserved. This remembering is not romantic, it is sacred. It is a response to a spiritual hunger caused by centuries of forced silence. It is not nostalgia, it is necessity. The rituals we relearn, the languages we recover, the clothes we wear, the food we cook, the names we speak. They are not trends, they are tools of resurrection. They are proof that even when the world tried to crush the African spirit hid, adapted, and endured. And now, with every drumbeat, with every braid, with every story told anew, it returns, not as a whisper but as a roar. The resistance never ended, it just changed form. What they stole we carried, what they silenced we sang, what they renamed we remembered, and what they thought was lost was only waiting for us.